Good evening and welcome to the last panel at this year's Urban Arc. It's a really exciting one. It's very close to the kind of work that I do. My name is Neha Sami. I'm faculty here at IHS and I also anchor the research program. We're really excited to have a set of very, very interesting papers, all speaking to, in one way or the other, the question of governance in the urban sphere, dealing with challenges of governing across scale, space, and institutions. Before we get started, I just want to make one announcement. We have one speaker less. Unfortunately, Thaisa Komeli will not be able to join us, and so we have 4 speakers instead of 5. But that hopefully will mean that we'll have time for a really rich discussion at the end. And so we'll run through all the presentations at the start and then take question and answers right at the end. But I would really like to encourage everyone in the audience to please use the Q&A function to post questions that you might have, and also to the panelists to keep an eye on the Q&A function. And in case there are questions that you would like to answer directly in the chat itself, please feel free to go ahead and do so. Without kind of waiting any longer, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Shreya Pillai, to start. Shreya will be talking about binaries of practice in the context of the development of large infrastructure, and will reflect not only on the processes of infrastructure development, but also on her own experience as a practitioner of having worked across the development of large infrastructure projects over almost 20 years of experience. So Shreya, over to you.
Hi, can you see my screen? Okay, and you can hear me? Okay, great.
Yes, all good.
Okay, great, thanks. Hi, everybody. My name is Shreya Pillai, and thank you for having me today. Today, I'm going to talk about the binaries of practice in the facilitation of large-scale infrastructure, and primarily from a human perspective. In the last 20 and 30 years, facilitated by reforms required by the World Bank, etc., cities in India started being developed. Since then, we've had more engagement in large-scale infrastructures than in the 50 years before. Bureaucracy and government structures in India have struggled to keep pace. Struggles with infrastructure are built into the very fabric of technical work. Because infrastructure is big, layered, and complex, it means different things at different levels. Changes take place and negotiation and adjustments with other systems. Nobody is really in charge. In the field, it means something. On the DPR and the paper headquarters, it means something else. Consequently, the socio-cultural aspects of bureaucratic engagement with large infrastructure encourages the exploration of another perspective. As part of the call for papers for the Urban Arc Conference 2020, I'm looking at work that I've done over the last 2 decades in the field of infrastructure in terms of few academic frameworks. These primarily include embeddedness, transparency, reach, membership, conventions of practice, relationships, connections, interventions, and proliferating networks. Investigating the vocabulary, experience, and perspectives of people defining infrastructure, those in the implementations and those serviced by the infrastructure, provides an ethnographic description of mega projects. I do this completely engaging with the fact that my identity is tied in with the bureaucracy associated with the projects, and yet as a consultant on social issues, I'm often an outsider to both the development of the concept and the process of implementation. Rethinking work practice ethnographically is complicated, but necessary to keep it relevant. This paper is a result of anecdotal evidence developed in conjunction with experience of the author, hereby being considered a field study. And I hope that this inquiry will help provide practice-driven insight into some of the power and culture binaries between the development of urban imaginaries and the reality on the ground. I'd like to start the presentation by describing 2 situations. The first involves a large city infrastructure project that required multiple stakeholder meetings, public consultations, a structured grievance redressal mechanism, and a transparent timeline. All of these requirements were agreed to by the government. Work started and I was involved in multiple public consultations and stakeholder meetings. Very soon into the process, I realized that these meetings were problematic. They followed a set pattern. Invites for the consultations would go out in local flyers, involved very little notice, and would usually be held around 6 p.m. in the weekdays. Very few people attended consequently. The facilitator, a local bureaucrat, a pleasant man, but of slightly authoritarian mindset, would present the project, allow for 2 or 3 questions, and then wrap up the session as soon as possible. Usually the questions were asked by 1 or 2 people and would typically be confrontational. The city government itself, though invited, would avoid these consultations. A few consultations down, the local bureaucrat went on leave. We managed to facilitate a couple of meetings, a meeting slightly differently. A junior government engineer facilitated and allowed for more questions and more time. What ensued was mayhem. I had expected this and was open to the idea. The government, not so much. People asked us many questions, very few actually related to the work that we were doing or going to be doing. They mainly asked us about basic city level infrastructure issues such as water connections, sewage treatment, etc. None of this was our mandate. There was a lot of anger. In time, the anger subsided and people began to ask more specific questions. We could not answer most of them. However, as the meeting wrapped up, I noticed many people stayed back to talk to us about the issues facing them. The local engineer and our contractor took down all these issues and decided to deal with them if possible. This pattern was then continued in multiple meetings because the local bureaucrat was still on leave. The consequence was that the structured public consultation and grievance redressal mechanism, which was quite bureaucratic and required travel to the ULB, filling out multiple forms, etc., was being sidestepped and an ad hoc mechanism had come about. This was not really the city or state acting. It was outside that realm and to some extent unofficial. We were accepting suggestions of the local population and in as far as we weren't crossing swords with the municipality. In another situation, regarding payment of compensation for temporary loss of income due to an infrastructure project, the state and the city government, while sympathetic to the issue, kept dragging their feet, thereby not allowing the process to go through. As one senior bureaucrat told me, it would set a precedent and then they would have to answer their next political masters. The relationship with the politicians was complicated and needed careful negotiation. The impasse was broken by the local contractor and a local consultant deciding to facilitate the compensation. It was not really a large amount of money. Again, this was not the city or state acting. It was outside the realm and was unofficial. We were facilitating social safeguards for the local population, again, without crossing boundaries with the municipality. While the structured compensation mechanism was not really getting engaged, an ad hoc mechanism had come about. Was this the right way to do it? I still don't know today, but a large number of people did not lose their livelihoods to the project, and that made the project equitable to some extent. The reality of both these situations is that they present for a blurriness of process that is difficult to explain within the usually structured frameworks that govern the development of large-scale infrastructures. None of these processes fall into a development plan, project reports, or even conceptual notes. A colleague once described this as jugaad, a Hindi term for patching things together, but I believe that it's much more than that. It is these offshoots/disruptions that spirals off the process that facilitate a significant part of infrastructure work in India. Much of this is not documented or even acknowledged, and that is problematic. In both the cases described above, the systemic response was unsuccessful. However, networks and relationships between the engineer and the contractor and various other agencies, local knowledge, non-development narratives, and intervention around the framework facilitated the project. To some extent, a system of disruptions and spirals was the framework now, thereby creating a binary of practice. The realities of work as a practitioner in urban development in India blur the lines of binaries. Working here and possibly further afield in the global south, there's no immediate solutions and certainly no absolutes. If one is even remotely mindful of the process one engages in, one has to question the foundation that as practitioners we engage with in our work. Most urban development practitioners, professionals such as architects, urban planners, engineers, geographers, etc., including me, receive training and practice in the Western idiom, and I put that in apostrophes. Today, cities in India are being defined and developed by a combination of professionals and advocacy organizations and bureaucrats that largely reflect this techno-bureaucratic efficiency-based models of development. As a professional engaged in the space of urban development, this is a persistent challenge and binary for me. I'm constantly engaged in interrogating the differences between the urban imaginary, mostly ignored local traditions of knowledge production, narratives, and the language of development, the binaries of classification and consultation, and then the practice-driven reality of tenders and deadlines. Over the last few years, I've been associated with quite a few urban infrastructure projects. As urban projects, they're ostensibly implemented by urban local bodies. However, herein begins one of the binaries that spirals out of control again. Funded and developed by the central government, most of these projects are actually facilitated by state-level parastatal agencies and implemented by consultants. Lacking in funds, the urban local body has very little input into either the conceptualization of the project or the implementation. As per mandate, the project will be brought to City Hall and the city councillors will vote to approve the project, regardless of their reservations. Most of the city councillors that I've met in the duration of these projects mostly agree with the overarching aims of the project, but have expressed concern about the process of the lack of consultation with the public during conceptualization. Many try to influence the project after it has been started, another instance of the pull and push of the development world. Other binaries that crop up regularly in the duration of large infrastructure projects involve the imaginaries of the urban as they were set out to be and the reality of the implementation. Most of the projects are long-standing exercises and often engage with the people they aim to serve only at the implementation stage. Very often, one is working in small towns and villages. The dynamics here are no different from that of big cities. In fact, the rapid social changes in India are producing local imaginaries that are not necessarily reflected in top-down policies. In one case where we had gone to facilitate a water and sanitation project, the villagers informed us that they were quite comfortable with their own sanitation systems and would like for us to facilitate better cable TV and internet services instead. Policymakers and bureaucrats make the mistake of dismissing narratives and demands of people of these towns. In other situations, contestations and violence are often used to reverse parts of these projects. In the town I worked in, a critical decision had apparently been questioned multiple times with the local MLA, but no heed had been paid. Finally, a set of road stoppage protests stopped the project. Post negotiation, another development scheme was engaged in by the district commissioner to facilitate the demands of the townsfolk. The irony is that just listening to the community would have avoided the aggression we had to deal with. I still don't believe that the final development reflected women or minority villagers at all, as we barely saw them at the negotiating table. And again, this could have been addressed with just a few consultations. Most of the negotiating members were wealthy landholding males. Additionally, what was interesting was the power dynamic presented an interesting situation from the government side, as most of the negotiating team was made up of women. In this case, the Tehsildar, the DC, who we considered the owner of the project, and the consultant, as the engineer. This again provides another interesting binary that while skills, knowledge of planning rules and procedures are partial and inadequate among councillors, locals, and the state is taking a primary role in shaping small towns, locals understand the intrinsic value and want to prevent themselves from being reduced to extensions of large cities. However, local representatives have very little say in the projects. With new rules such as the RTFLA, RRA, Forest Act, etc., efforts are being made to facilitate the needs of the public through consultation and to facilitate social and environment safeguards. However, these efforts are infrequent and usually facilitated well into the implementation of a project. The detailed project report does not require public consultation. Additionally, the format of public consultation and grievance redressal mechanisms are complex. Unless facilitated sensitively, they leave out the voices of most of the vulnerable population, women, aged, differently abled, affected by the project. Years of neglect by civic agency also means that most of the population is apathetic to large-scale infrastructure. The voices one tends to hear at public consultations often belongs to the more powerful and the loudest. Language and the caste community and asymmetry of information shared are other parts of the complex binary involved in the facilitation of large infrastructure. The social practices, norms, and individual behaviors of agents involved in the implementation projects are also necessary to explain the reality of the urban imaginary of these projects. The men, women, consultants, bureaucrats the institutions that facilitate the infrastructure projects, their capacity, individual imaginaries, capabilities, networks, vulnerabilities, insecurities, power, and politics affect how a project is realized. Governmental institutions in India are often seen as authoritative and destructive. However, this exaggerates the importance of the institutions and understates the influence of the agencies or the people involved interacting with and in the government. Bureaucracies like municipalities, ostensibly the implementers of large-scale infrastructure projects, are more and more fragmented and often uncertain and have to build alliances across various networks today. Other officials, critics, publics, non-government agencies, and this really affects what they know, are capable, and how they operate. And then the reality of the urban imaginary. What happens in the field and in reality depends very greatly upon these encounters between these various officials, departments, and people, and the interpretations of the various people in the field. Essentially, official knowledge is constantly getting made. It is not an absolute. Rather, it's a combination of ways of seeing the imaginary. This is often contrary to what we think of official imaginaries. I hope that this paper explains to some extent what the disruptions and the spirals and the binaries are involved from a human perspective in the development of large-scale infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreya. That was perfectly on time. It was a really, really interesting presentation. Actually, something that I work on quite closely. I was particularly interested to hear kind of the distinction that you were making between sort of the city state institutions and the people who are involved in the process. And I'd love to hear more if we have time later on in the questions. I'd like to now invite our second speaker, Rahul Sharma, to present. Rahul will be focusing on a slightly different scale of presentation or of scale of analysis, focusing a lot on sort of the process of ranking in metrics within government and the way in which they work, the way we should be rethinking them, and the role that they play within policy. So over to you, Rahul.
Thanks a lot. I'll just pull up my presentation. Just give me 1 second. All right, is this visible? Great. Okay, so I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to be presenting on understanding this process of target shifting in government to government rankings. This is sort of, say, 1/3 of a much larger project that I'm working on. Given the time limitations, I've restricted it to this much, and I'll dive right in. So basically, what we're seeing now for the last 5-6 years is that in India, there's a large number of government to government ranking initiatives that are started, right? So it's this is very particular. It's where a national government ranks city governments or state governments or district governments in a way, in sort of the objective is to improve performance through ranking and competition. Ranks, however, are not new. They're new in the context of government rankings of the governments. They've been used extensively in the past and even currently by third-party ranking agencies such as Mercer or The Economist or US News that ranks universities in the US. But really, I think we're in a new moment here, and I think it's interesting to understand what happens when governments start ranking other governments, right? So this is what the larger context of this is. Now, while ranks are supposed to induce competition and improve performance, the impact of rankings is quite mixed, right? They sometimes improve performance, but they sometimes even worsen performance. One of the reasons that they worsen performance is because they can demotivate losing participants, right? That's what ranks are very particular in that case. That when people just don't do well, they stop getting interested in participating anymore. One of the most important things about rankings that we've seen is that they are prone, like many performance assessment systems, to gaming, right? So what is this gaming? And I'm saying gaming or learning because I'm trying to reframe this idea a little bit with respect to public sector rankings. So gaming, basically something that participants, or who I call agents. I'm writing this for a political science audience, so please just ignore the whole principal agent thing, but I'll use it a lot. It's not how I see them in those ways. But agents who are participating in the system, they are prone to gaming. That is, they misreport or they sort of sub-optimize the ranking in order to do better in the ranking system. Recent literature also shows that principals, who are the agency that's actually doing the ranking or that makes the ranking program, are also indulging in gaming. And the way that they do this is through target shifting. And so what they do is they either introduce new metrics or they omit certain metrics that are uncomfortable, or they devise new methods of measuring performance, right? And so we see that, okay, we're not performing so well on this thing. Let's have a new metric that actually makes us look better, right? Now, the question that I'm interested in is the fact that, these studies and sort of our current understanding of that rankings make some very debatable assumptions, strong assumptions about the motivations of the principal, right? And they do this because they draw on experience within the private sector and these third-party gaming systems, third-party ranking systems, and apply them to the public sector, and in that way fail to account for the objectives that governments might have, right? In particular, and target shifting may not just be about gaming in that context. So I adopt a different framework. I adopt the framework of learning. And here, just to say that this is not me being supportive of any government or its policies. I'm just trying to be trying to explore alternative explanations, right? We'll see what we actually end up with as results. So 3 forms of gaming. Peter May talks about it in a seminal piece that he wrote on policy learning and failure. Is political learning, which is that you learn about the political feasibility of this policy. Social learning is that you learn more about how to construct the problem. How is this particular policy playing out when you actually implement it. Instrumental learning, which is really about learning about simple things like the tools. Does this work better than that? Is it better to measure something this way or that way? Things like that, right? So this project very broadly is asking, what if target shifting is an example of policy learning and not gaming? And then explores alternative explanations through the analysis of the SWOT survey, right? Which is this, right? So the Swachh Prediction, I think some people must be familiar with it. It's a national ranking program that's being implemented by the government of India. It ranks cities in India on waste management and sanitation outcomes. It started small in 2016 with 73 cities. It has 4,000 plus cities by 2020. I'm not using 2021 data because I can't keep collecting data endlessly, mostly. Now, what's important is this, that it has 4 main score components until 2020, right? There's a service level progress, which is a self-reported component where cities actually assess themselves and say, look, this is how we performed on various metrics. And it has 3 externally observed components, right? The independent observation, citizen feedback, and certification. This distinction is useful. I'll use it later. But basically, it allows us to compare between how people self-report their scores versus how external assessors view the performance of cities, right? I'll use the data from 2016 to 2020. I also did a lot of work on trying to find revenue data. It's not really available, as we know very well, but where I could, I found it. And so this is, I have about 471 cities in my data set of cities above 1 lakh. I don't use the entire data. All right, so, sorry, I'm just trying to move forward. Right. Now, there are 3 pathways that I come up with here and that I'll explain, right? The first is the political learning pathway. And here, the precise mechanism at play is one about improving collective reputation, right? So we said that political learning is about actually showing that the policy is feasible, right? Performance of subnational governments in aggregate reflects the performance of national governments, right? This is what is different about government-to-government rankings as opposed to a third-party ranking system where there are no stakes. Reputation is a collective good that's held in common by the subnational national governments, and therefore, as the principle, the national government has strong incentives to demonstrate success, right? So what should we see in this case? We should see that the scores actually increase over time. But most importantly, we should see that they increase over time as compared to the counterfactual scenario where there was no target shifting, right? So what I do is I construct a counterfactual scenario in which the 2016 weights were consistent throughout the program. And I'll show you this target shifting a little bit more closely in a bit. Just give me 1 second. I might have missed one slide. Sorry, this is the slide that I wanted to, before I move forward, this is the target shifting that I've been talking about. I'm having some trouble with moving my slides. But basically, we've seen with the Swachh survey that the service level data, which is the self-reported data, starts as 50% of the total score that makes up for the rank of the city, and it reduces over the years. Similarly, the externally observed data, this is at sort of 25-25 and kind of remains constant, but you have these 2 new externally observed scores that come in much later, right? So there's all this moving of targets that is happening. Coming back to this, what I wanted to say here is that we should see the scores increase if there is political learning, if there is this reputation building happening, and it should actually be more than what we see in the counterfactual scenario. The second mechanism that I articulate is that principals might be interested in supporting the less capacitated smaller cities, right? So this is a form of social learning. We know that in the case of governments, principal governments have obligations under a federal compact, right, to adapt the ranking to help less capacitated agent governments. This is again not the case with third-party ranking systems where there are no stakes. I won't get into this, but national governments, both formally and informally, engage in a large number of asymmetric relationships, right? So they treat certain member units differently than other member units. We know this about India quite well, and certain states and districts in India. So this is one reason why government-to-government ranking systems might be prone to distortions, and where social learning would essentially involve understanding the negative impacts that ranks have on the smaller and less capacitated cities. As we know, that rankings can demotivate participants. So the second mechanism that I'm articulating here, which is a social learning mechanism, is that we should observe that the smaller and less capacitated cities actually perform better over time. That might be what's coming out of target shifting, right? The third thing that target shifting might be for is an instrumental learning, which is that they just produce better rankings, right? This is kind of in muddling through in the Lindblom sort of, trying to try various things to trial and error, and then arriving at the best methodology or the best set of metrics that represent waste management and sanitation outcomes, right? If this is the case, then what we should observe is 3 things, right? We should observe that the difference between the self-reported and observed scores, now I pointed out to those 2 types of scores, should reduce over time, right? Where they should start to converge. the correlation between the externally observed scores and the total score should improve over time, right? And the weights of the self-reported score should ideally reduce or converge to the externally observed scores over time, right? I'll just leave this here for a second or two so people can just absorb these three things that are going to happen, and we can come back to them in the discussion. Okay, so what do I actually observe? Here's just a summary, right? These are the mechanisms: improving collective reputation, supporting smaller cities, produce accurate rankings. Three types of learning, why they would do it, and then what we should observe. So in terms of collective reputation, what do we see? We see that the total scores actually decrease over time, right? However, compared to the counterfactual scenario with the 2016 weights, the total scores increase. So here are the graphs for that. So what you're seeing here, the counterfactual scenario is the one with the dashed lines, right? This is the scenario in which the government did not engage in target setting, right? Shifting. The targets remained as they were, the weights remained as they were in 2016, right? And we see that there's quite a bit of difference between what the scores would have been had the government stuck to the 2016 weights versus what the scores are now, given the new weights that have been used. We see the difference across even disaggregated analysis, where I disaggregate by large in blue, medium in red, and small in orange or yellow cities. These are classifications of the swept surveyation, wherein the counterfactual scenario is below the actual scenario in all cases. Okay, so that's number one. What about supporting smaller cities? Here, actually, we don't find any evidence. In fact, smaller cities are performing worse over time. So let's look at these two graphs. Right. So this graph on the left essentially is showing you how many cities of each category, large, medium, and small, are in the top quintile, right? And in percentage terms, the large cities tends to be generally increasing over time. Small cities, and that's most important, the red one, over time, actually the percentage of smaller cities in the top quintile reduces over time. We see a similar case with the bottom quintile, where the small cities actually increase over time. So overall, the small cities are not doing well on the top, and they're not doing well at the bottom. They are not performing well as with these new targets. If we compare it to the counterfactual scenarios, we actually see no relationship. We don't see that the target shifting actually has impacted the performance of cities at all, because the counterfactual scenario and the actual scenarios are actually pretty well aligned. Right, so it's not like the new targets have helped the smaller cities shift in any way. And the final thing that I was talking about is that it might just be an effort to produce better rankings, right? And I'll just explain this by straight away going to the results, right? So three things here. One is that we see that over time, just by design, and we can call it design now in retrospect, but it was never part of design. It's just what has happened, right? That actually there is a convergence between the self-reported data and the externally observed data, right? In general, this is a good thing. Sorry, I'm just checking the chat. Right. Yes, I will finish. But we observe two other things that are useful. One is that the correlation between the observed scores and the total scores increases over time as compared to the counterfactual. Importantly, the correlation between the self-reported score and the observed scores also increase over time. So something positive is happening here in terms of the quality of the ranks themselves, right? They are improving. I'll summarize in the next two slides. All right, so the analysis here suggests that target shifting has led to some political learning and some instrumental learning, right? The good news is that the quality of ranks is improving, right? In some way, that is just looking at this data. However, in aggregate, cities are not performing well over time, right? They're performing better than the counterfactual no target shifting scenario. In this context, it was possible to interpret this as a form of gaming, right? That if I had not target shifted, my cities would not be performing as well as they are. Two, the fundamental problem with ranks, which is that, and performance measurement in general, right, that they reinforce inequality is continuous, right? So there is no social learning. Small cities just do not perform better. You shift targets or don't shift targets, they don't perform better, right? So ranks, if used in the context of these kind of principal-agent relationships, right, where there are stakes, as compared to a third-party relationship, need to meet multiple goals. And without this, they're less likely to be useful. My last slide is that from the perspective of cities, right, these ranks are really quite symbolic. You either get a high rank or you get an award, right? There's no sort of real fiscal transfer that's happening. the stakes are not high enough from a public choice perspective, right? People are not going to shift to a new city just because there's better waste management outcomes, right? So the stakes are very low. In this context, and this is the one place where I bring in the word binaries to allude a little bit to the topic of the entire conference, selecting winners and losers in this sort of very binary mechanism is actually quite counterproductive, right? Governments actually function to regulate exactly this kind of failure, and you're seeing that kind of failure happening in the smaller cities, right? So last point, I think it's fine to have ranks as one. This is part of a much larger Swachh Bharat mission, right? And so maybe the ranks are not that important. But actually, in this context, the ranks do have a great supportive environment where they could produce some results because of the Swachh Bharat mission and how much money is there. But really, I think it's more useful to think about more development-focused approaches like self-assessment or investments in capacity, as opposed to kind of selecting winners and losers, and building capacities for administrative data management in parallel with embarking on such programs. I'll stop there. I've just put my email and my Twitter thing. So if anyone wants to note that down, please do. I am speaking from an isolation room because I have COVID. So I don't know if I'll survive till the question answer, which is why I've done this, but I'll try to come back definitely for that. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Rahul. There's so much to unpack here, and I'd like to hear lots more about sort of incentives, also the role of the private sector, and to see whether there's any sort of link with other kinds of investments, etc., that are made, and whether it leads to other kinds of benefits to cities beyond just their sort of ranking, and whether there are other kind of layers to these the way the rankings move, and maybe we can come back to it in the Q&A. But for now, we'll move to our next speaker. I'd like to invite Lakshyayog, who will be speaking to us about governing bodies and the relationship between sort of physical spaces of actually physical activity and health, and the relationship of that with governing urban spaces. So over to you, Lakshyayog.
Thank you, Neha. I'll just share my screen. I hope it's visible. Yeah, so a very good evening to everyone, and I would like to first thank IHS for giving me this opportunity to share my work. So as you can see, the title of my presentation is Governing the Bodies and Producing the Fit City, 3 Logics to Open Gym in Delhi. So this the work is part of my PhD project, and it's still like ongoing work. As part of the it's a smaller part of the larger project, and the larger question which I'm probing is that how physical activity is mobilized at a global level by actors such as WHO and national governments, and how such an mobilization results into mobilization at national and local level through instruments such as master plan, or even campaigns such as smart city mission and etc. So what I'm going to do here is kind of start from the very categories which I found in the field. So if you look at if you start talking to people, which I have been doing from past 3 years, to people about fitness and physical activities, the kind of practices they engage with, you find across categories such as sehat, tandrusti, kasrat, ghumna, time pass, tehelna in parks of Delhi, and these are not the categories which you find in the policy instruments of either WHO or even for the national government of India. So what you find is that there is a disconnect between the way physical activities, fitness practices are being, the meaning making process which is going on among the people, and the ways in which government is trying to maneuver the social space or the physical space of the cities to improve or to mobilize people towards physical activity. And what happens here is you have an initiative which we call Open Gyms. So what I'm going to do is talk about this mobilization of physical activities in the cities, and I look at the case study of Open Gyms in Delhi, and it's a project which started in 2014 in city, and New Delhi Municipal Corporation took the lead, and they installed the first Open Gym in Lodi Garden and Nehru Park as well. So what we look at is that in the policy sphere, so there is a dual backdrop to these studies. One is the policy modes of thinking, in which physical activity or any activity which kind of contributes towards health is conceptualized as physical activity. So it may be fitness, it may be walking, it may be jogging, whatever. It's called physical activity, and it has a relation with environment because it has been recognized as one of the leading risk factors of non-communicable diseases by WHO. It is also an important health issue. WHO has been releasing national action plans to to push states to combat the issue of leading increasing physical inactivity. India by far is one of the nation which has highest inactive population. So Lancet kind of produces three series on physical inactivity and argues that it's actually a global pandemic, and it also has a relation to the national healthcare cost. So and there comes the role of urban planning. So there is a lot of planners who kind of comment that they treat urban planning as an instrument of increasing physical activity in cities. And this is all across the world. This is both in the global north and also in the global south. So what we look at is translation happening in India. So when Smart City mission was placed, was kickstarted, the installation of open gyms was seen as development of open space. You can see in one of the banner which was advertised by Smart City Mission website. And then comes the private sector coming in which they're launching, wellness indexes. ICICI Lombard launching first wellness index in India. A slew of ministers launching fitness challenge, and then it culminates in the form of a grand Fit India challenge launched by Prime Minister Modi, which kind of aims to take on the path nation on the path of fitness and wellness. So this is the other backdrop of physical activity scenario in which it is contextualized in the everyday life of the people. It is contextualized in the scenarios of liberty, in scenarios of accessibility, in scenarios of gender and others. So what I'm trying to do is to understand this, mobilization to physical activity or installation of open gyms through the lens of governmentality. And what do we have governmentalities? I have adopted the framework from the writings of, Foucault, Marco Leptingal, who write specifically in relation to, sports and physical activity, and Rose and Middle. And Foucault talks about this regulation of individual lives, which involves procedure analysis and calculations. And when I'm arguing here is these procedure analysis and calculations are actually the activities of the state by different actors in which they push people to towards being more healthy. What happens is they want the population to be healthy and productive, and they take measures such as open gyms, and there are other measures to make population healthy. And then it is through these interlocking apparatus that we create an urge among the people to be fit, physically active. What happens is it works like a regulated freedom, and if you want to understand, what is the dynamics of physical activity, you have to actually understand what is how people are actually, what is the process of meaning making, what meanings people are attaching to physical activity in which they engage in. It's also part of a larger framework where there is a healthy lifestyle is socially marketable under the larger neoliberal project. So what I propose is through my method has been mainly ethnographic, and what I propose under this is the three logics to open if one want to understand why open gym may be particularly installed. The first logic is the open gym as a social infrastructure and its provision, and the other is a social open gym as a social space, and third is open gym as a device for the healthy body. So if you look at as a social infrastructure, Lantham and Latham talks about that how cities have been branded for attractive places of living using sports, and they talk about the politics of provision. What happens is when open gyms becomes one of the medium through which development funding is granted to wards up to the level of wards, it's also become a very populist medium of granting the funding. So all the public representatives fight among itself that how many parks under them should be having an open gym, and that is why precisely the reason that if you look at if you analyze the number of projects which are granted under MP LAD, which was stopped in 2020 because of COVID, but it was one of the you get 5 crore rupees to invest in a project. To any project the MP wants to invest in. Open gyms actually top the list, and this has been happening over time from 2014. So if you look at, I just look at one of the ward in Chirag Delhi, and this was one of the ward which is selected by SDMC to install the first open gym in under SDMC. And if you look at that, what happens is these rights are so open gym, and you can see that each of park they get multiple open gyms, and they are actually funded by different public representatives. So there is one gym funded by the MLA, and there is one gym which is funded by the MP. And then you also have larger fights taking place over Twitter, because we live in a era of Twitter. So you have MPs and MLAs fighting over the to take credits for installing open gyms. You also look at, it is being advertised all across the city as, open gym as one of the major achievements of the municipal corporations. What happens is also the private sector also wants to come in and want to participate in the game of making people fit. And you have the first gym which was installed in the Lodi Garden, actually funded and supported by the Lions International in Manapura Guru. But then there is another logic to this open gym is a social space. And if you look at, if you want to understand publics and how they are governed, then you also one also want to look at that how these spaces are produced. And I'm specifically talking about here as these spaces produce as gendered spaces. So we talk about that every space have a different affordance. They have something different to offer, and the assumption of inert space actually doesn't work. So here I'm going to talk about the three different field sites. One is the urban village, and other is the planned colony. So if you look at the Chirag Delhi Park, where which is one of my site, you look at that, parks are normally being used by different set of actors, and because of the traditional norms in the urban villages, you have a segregation of social spaces, and you have women sitting different in different spaces than men. And men parks are basically the spaces where men, they come, they do time pass, they smoke hookah, they play cards, and that's all across all over the year in Delhi, or the time for that changes. And then you also have women sitting in the same park. So if you go and ask a woman that, how is she going to participate in physical activities in the so-called open gyms, the women in Chirag Delhi have a lot of hesitation. You also have the same scene in Sanjayvan, which is in East Delhi, where it is at the juncture of a planned locality in an urban village, and you have a mixture of both the population coming in. And what you see is also again a segregation of social space. You have in other Lodi Garden, where which is much more elite, and you have a space which is available to the surrounding locality, and you have a lot of associations, a lot of groups which perform in yoga, and you don't see much of a gender segregation there. You also have different actors coming in, such as the juice corner. You have Zumba classes and all, which are all happening in Lodi Garden. This is one of the statement which quite struck me during the field. And when a woman was asked not to go in the park because the social surrounding, which they call normally mohalla, is the people are laughing at her for practicing in open gym, and that which actually points out that the contextual meanings of gender and place actually play a very important role in experience of women who are involved in physical activity. And this is much more important when you have a diverse city such as Delhi. So the last logic which I talk about is the device for a healthy body, and here I come bring in the conception of body light, who talks about that even bodies at rest are the sites of capital accumulation, because private property and the accumulation of capital as a key tenets of capitalism has actually inflated the everyday life. You have Bas's work, Bas works, who talks about the muscular bodies and the imagination of this muscular body and how they're accepted in the public and the public sphere. And this also not only works as a physical body, but it also has a social function. So what you have is this boards put up by NDMC where they expect people to kind of monitor their working out timings. You can also calculate the number of calories burned. You can also calculate that at what speed you run, so that how much fat are you going to burn in a particular park. And it's part of a larger program which they call fitness train. You also have a description of different warm-up stations along the park, and the number of calories you are going to burn and all. But it kind of comes up, it considers body as a machine. So if you're working on it, you work on different parts, you kind of going to burn certain number of calories, and then you're going to be fit and healthy. What has happens is this is an extension of the larger neoliberal model, because you have a corporatization of commercialization of sports and fun happening, and where health becomes individualistic phenomena to work on. So individuals work as entrepreneurial self, they have to work on their own health, and government only kind of nudges and they maneuver spaces so that people have the urgency or the urge to work out on themselves. It also kind of relates to the neoliberal ideologies of healthism, active living, and consumerism. So what is happening all across is the body is being disciplined constantly for instrument of work and labor. And in many ways, that body decoration has actually replaced a potent symbol of status and behavior. So what I argue in through all these logics is essentially that the conception of fit body, a fit of productive body, is central to the way a fit city is imagined or governed at a national level. So you have there are parts in which even if the government wants to invest on larger fitness programs such as Fit India movement and all, you have a conception of body which is inherent in that, which is that of a conception of fit and gendered body. You also have a health marketing of healthy lifestyle, in which you see such ads propagating on Instagram, you have on Twitter, where you have watches, you have instruments available to kind of measure your the number of hours, the number of footsteps you take in, and they all are kind of propagated, they all are celebrated as models of Fit India. So all these three logics of open gym, and what you understand is that there is a certain conception of governing the city, and it happens through governing a body in which the focus is on production of a fit and gender body. So this is where I end, and thank you. And I hope that we continue to engage in physical activities and be active, but at the same time we have a conception of a body which is not just productive but also healthy in our own ways.
Thank you. Thanks, Lakshyayog, for that, and just a really nice sort of bringing together of multiple ways of both recreational spaces as well as activities that are being sort of pushed and promoted based on incentives. Um, like I said, we're one panelist short today, so we'll move on to the final paper in the panel. And this comes to us from Pondicherry, and again, a very different way of understanding the process of governance. So we have Lalitha and her colleagues speaking to us about heritage and hesitant urban production in Pondicherry, talking about the politics of heritage and conservation. So Lalitha, over to you.
Hi, thank you, IHS, for giving us the opportunity to present the preliminary study, which is part of a broader research we are conducting at the French Institute of Pondicherry under the project titled ROOS, Urban and Socio-Ecological Resilience of the Pondicherry Bioregion, funded by the French Development Agency. I'm Lalitha and will be presenting today. My co-authors, Nicolas and Devangi, are also here to answer questions in the chat box and Q&A. I start with the question, what image comes to mind when we speak of Pondicherry? Search the web or social media for Pondicherry, and these descriptions and images will flood your results. French Riviera of the East, a little slice of France, and countless selfies against yellow-washed walls. Trying to make sense of how this image making has taken shape and its implications for the city's urban future instigated our study. Our main starting hypothesis is that instead of undergoing a process involving a sensitive reflection on post-colonial identity, there has instead progressively emerged a preoccupation around the valorization of French colonial heritage, both tangible and intangible. Exploring the question of heritage has led us to mobilize a framework inspired by the idea of counter-heritage by Dennis Byrne, where he posits that a hegemonic view of heritage often ends up excluding local stakeholders and communities from any role in the future of the spaces they reside in. A counter-heritage lens instead recognizes that different classes of people, based on the objects and places they encounter and live with, evolve different memories of heritage. We try to answer 4 key questions through this lens of counter-heritage. How has heritage entered public discourse and become a central part of urban policy? Who relies on the rhetoric of heritage and tourism, and what is at stake in the implementation of urban projects that emerge as a result? What conflictual dynamics occur as a result of these urban projects? How does heritage tourism rhetoric affect the routines and material conditions of local residents? To briefly situate Pondicherry and the areas under discussion, Pondicherry was a colony of the French East India Company. In 1962, it became a union territory of India consisting of 4 enclaves as seen on the map. The colonial core, known as the Boulevard town, is considered the heritage area of the city. It is divided into Tamil Quarter to the west and French Quarter to the east, which is still referred to as the White Town. North of the Boulevard area lies the municipal wards of Solenagar, Vaitikuppam, and Kurichikuppam, and to the south lies the Brayapad. The coastal edges of these wards are home to traditional fishing settlements that pre-existed the arrival of the French. Most tourism is concentrated in the French Quarter, marked by government and the hospitality sector as the window to French culture in India. With this background, we examine the heritage, how heritage has entered public discourse and become a central part of urban policy. We looked at the 3 comprehensive development plans prepared for the Pondicherry urban area. The first CDP of 1983 makes no mention of the Boulevard town as a heritage area, nor proposed any conservative measures for it. Tourism is not considered as a potential source of employment or revenue generation for the UT. This changes in the CDP of 1997, in which the conservation of the urban and architectural heritage of Pondicherry's Boulevard town and the conservation of the coastal zone become a focus area. The inclusion coincides with the establishment of the intact Pondicherry in 1985. As we see from the table, informality is considered undesirable and incompatible with heritage tourism and needs to be cleaned up. In the latest CDP 2019, it is evident from the proposed conservation strategies that heritage is fully established within the public discourse, but glaringly it excludes the Tamil quarters of Boulevard, considering only the French Quarter as a heritage zone. The proposed land use published with the CDP 2019 rezones the primarily residential Tamil Quarter as a mixed-use commercial. The land use of French Quarter remains unchanged. Thus, as stated by Michael Hitchcock and others, heritage is constructed through processes of selection and elimination appropriated by the state and its agents and objectified to become worthy of political, economic, and tourist attention. Tracing the heritage tourism discourse reveals 3 major stakeholder groups. First, the government, in which the Department of Tourism has great capacity to fund tourism-related urban projects. Second, citizen groups, of which Intact Pondicherry wields the most power to influence urban policies and projects as design consultant for most public and private funded heritage tourism projects. Also disseminating their definition of heritage through heritage walks, festivals, and publications. Third, local communities, which are residents residing within this area, transforming rapidly as a result of heritage tourism urban production, but having the least influence and stake. Note that these 3 groups are the ones producing the politics of heritage, highly marked by coalitions and conflicts among themselves and across groups. During our interviews, we asked stakeholders to describe their examples of heritage. Their responses further reinforces the extent of each group's influence and stake in the public discourse on heritage and tourism. Citizen groups had no doubt about that. For them, the colonial buildings of the Boulevard town represented the city's heritage. The joint CEO's definition clearly demonstrates the influence of citizen groups. In contrast, among Kurichikuppam residents, the term heritage itself required unpacking. The English definition of heritage held no meaning for them. So the nearest Tamil alternatives, kalacharam, culture, and parambaryam, tradition, were used. Note how their answers connect directly and deeply to their everyday lived experiences. Though they live at the edge of the Boulevard town, less than 500 meters away, they rarely enter it, thus demonstrating that spatial proximity does not necessarily overcome social barriers. The key takeaways are each stakeholder groups attached their own meanings to heritage. These meanings subjective to their own memories and material conditions. The heritage discourse in the city is dominated by elite groups and continues to be reflected in ongoing policy and projects. As a result, urban production, both public and private, rely heavily on aesthetics and image making of a past colonial nostalgia. The beach promenade, which forms the eastern seaside edge of the French Quarter, underwent a revitalization in 2010 and has since become popular outdoor venue with residents and tourists alike. Its success has triggered several other state and central level proposals increasingly preoccupy themselves with the development of urban coastline. The smart city proposal converges unrealized projects from schemes such as Swadesh Darshan. It also crystallizes the link between heritage and tourism by positioning them as interdependent for creating employment opportunities for the city. The old distillery is a spatial marker of the edge between the boulevard and the village. This is the visualization of the beach road extension into Kurichikuppam. What stands out is the wall separating the existing village from the new promenade. What is its purpose? We use this image to instigate responses to a question about the project from the stakeholders group. What stands out from the responses are the conflictual dynamics, the aspiration of the urban project versus the neighborhood reality, and ambiguity from the government about what form the road will eventually take, how they intend to negotiate with the residents that may need to be moved from their homes, conflict between who the road is being built for, residents or tourists. This ambiguity continues with the citizen groups, yet most of them are of the opinion that the road extension will be beneficial to the local community. They also point out that selfishness of those people in looking out for their own interests and denying access to valuable real estate. One respondent suggested that they should be taught how to monetize their properties which are in prime locations. The lack of information about the project that directly impacts the Kurichikuppam fishing community highlights their exclusion from any of the ongoing public discourse on coastal tourism. It's as if the project has become part of local folklore or myth. It is notable that their concerns with the project's impact are completely rooted in their routines and material conditions, loss of home and livelihood versus the abstract concerns voiced by the other groups. The proposed intervention clearly portrays the alienation of Kurichikuppam's residents from their own neighborhood and symbolizes alienation by fixing their spatial limits. And another crucial issue is the profound uncertainty of the project. There is an evident hesitancy in framing and building these projects in terms of developing and beautifying the local neighborhood by further marginalizing the local residents. Meanwhile, residents, among other entrepreneurs in real estate, have found their own space within this dynamic of urban hesitancy. Kurichikuppam is gentrifying as many upper class are investing to live in a central area close to the Sri Aurobindo ashram, while the tsunami and then the price of land convinced many fishermen to sell their properties to outsiders. Second homes, apartments, or guest houses are slowly flourishing. In conclusion, I would like to rephrase Jennifer Robinson's argument. Subaltern in general need to decolonize the idea of global heritage city, not just because it is non-inclusive, but it is still mainly irreconcilable with the main material conditions and livelihoods of local communities. In our case, the fishing community. This concluding remark opens up to study more closely the living space of these coastal settlements beyond binaries or idealist consideration about the tension happening within the neighborhood. That's our next agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Lalitha. We already have a few questions in the Q&A box, and a couple of them are directed towards Rahul. I don't know if you're here and you'd like to take a response to a couple of them.
Yeah, I'll just look at them just.
Sure.
So Mr. Rajesh Kumar Sarkar asks if the comparison is done with, yes, that's right. It's not the same statistical data. It's every year I'm looking at which cities are in the small, medium, large category. So yes, if the cities are growing over time, that is incorporated in the analysis. Because it's an annual categorization. Every year I change which cities are in which category. So great, that's one. And then Ramakrishnan is asking, this is a question for ranking, is the framework of analysis on ranking assumptions that efforts is constant over time. Great. So I think if I may be allowed to rephrase, and this is a really great fundamental question on the identification strategy, right? So basically the question that how do you know the thing that you're measuring is resulting from the particular treatment that you have in mind, and not something else that's outside in the world, right? So just in those the sort of econometric framing of it. And yes, there might be other effects. The way I'm seeing this is basically, so the assumption that I'm making is that cities are responding to the weight changes more strongly than they're responding to other kinds of learning effects like peer learning or internal improvements. And the reason that I'm comfortable making this assumption is that, and actually there's a second part of this paper that talks about it more, is that in some ways the change in the weighting scheme appears as an exogenous shock to the system, right? And it can, because given the timelines required for implementing complex infrastructure projects that actually improve waste management outcomes or sanitation outcomes, right? I feel it is unlikely that cities will be able to make real change in response to the new weights, in a year's time, where they're reporting 4 times a year, right? And so therefore, it is more likely that cities are able to, are going to resort to securing their positions in the ranking system by focusing a lot on the actual data collection and reporting, or on the scores. So I don't know if that makes sense, but in that sense, that's the identification a problem that I'm trying to work with here. It is likely that there are minor effects of other kinds of variables in the model, if I were to speak in those terms.
Thanks, Rahul. And I'd encourage others to put more questions in the Q&A box. And while we wait for them, I actually had a couple of questions for the panel. So one, Rahul, I wanted to sort of ask you a little bit more about if you could reflect, beyond the sort of just the government to government use of the ranking system. If in the work that you've been doing, you've been seeing these rankings being used for other purposes, to direct investment, for example. And to kind of see, whether that the use of these kind of shifting targets and shifting rankings are being also used for purposes beyond just the thing that they're designed to do, in some senses.
Yes. So unfortunately, I haven't gotten to the other programs yet. That's the larger project. And I think what I'll do is I'll maybe just to respond. I think there is a salience question. There is, and that's not so. I believe that behavior will be different when that ranking program has high versus low salience. As the last slide said here, I believe this ranking program has low salience comparatively, just because there are no real transfers happening. But there might be other programs like the aspirational district programs where the salience is much higher, where there might be also sort of a greater possibility of mobility, right, from industry. I mean, we care about this kind of thing where the sort of public choice thing comes up when industry moves because taxation is different across subnational units. So we might see that in other cases. I haven't come there yet, but that's the larger project. And I think over the next 3-4 years, that's basically, I want to write a story about this moment where we went and really just ranked everything. I think it'll be an interesting story to tell. Yeah.
Thanks. There are a couple of questions in the chat box for Lalitha. I don't know, Lalitha, if you want to look at them and try and respond, or if any of your other co-authors would like to respond. And you can respond both in there, but also respond live in person.
Yes, may I?
Please.
Hello, yeah, I'm Nicolas. I'm part of the team. So we were very much looking to go beyond binaries, but as in 10 minutes is kind of very difficult. But there is a whole complexity of the kind of what some people say poor people politics, considering that many fishermen are not poor anymore and not very vulnerable anymore. So what we refer to as a community is not a community. But indeed, we interviewed a lot of fishermen and fisherwomen who are, and especially enter in touch with the panchayat, authorities, who are not very speaking in the same line, or speaking against the government, and on the other side, playing the game of speculation for their own strategies or just own needs. So the opinion is not one. That's why we finished on the question of we have to go deeper into this kind of local politics, because there are a lot of coalitions between government institutions and people, between political parties like regional parties especially, and political parties from within the locality, and especially the CPIM. So that's an ongoing research we cannot conclude, but it seems that, and it's linked with this kind of background on ranking, on following very closely how urban policies are implemented. It seems that the local government is much more kind of put a lot of energy in responding to the necessities of ranking, of reporting, than to kind of negotiate the implementation of specific project, being good or bad. But as it is, this project is going, this idea is going on since the last 20-25 years, which is, this place is not, it's not a unique case in, all the slums, all that. The politics of uncertainty makes you vulnerable. In front of any infrastructure coming from the state, and also about like this, what real estate investors are trying to defend as not only as a strategy, as a kind of peer-to-peer kind of implementation. You cannot say that there's a strong gentrification, and Pondicherry is not Bombay or Bangalore, but still you see this like very one-to-one houses, land sold at the cost of the common space, which is the living space, which is kind of the local economy, which is at stake. So for us, trying to focus now on the public space is working on the working space, the economic space of how to fish in this condition of strong infrastructure transformation, material transformation. Thank you. I hope it responds partly.
Thank you. So while we wait for more questions to come in, I'm not sure if Shreya is still here, but if she is, I'd like to ask her a question on some of the work that she's been doing. And Shreya was actually wanting to ask if you could perhaps expand a little bit more on the kind of the politics of the actors themselves that were involved, both within city and state institutions, but also outside, and just reflect a little bit on the kind of roles that you've seen them play and the influences that they have had in the kind of projects that you've been observing or involved in.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Can you hear me? Okay. So what was interesting for me in most of my projects is, there's this, everyone seems to think that the ULB, a lot of the large infrastructure projects, and they are developed by parastatals or by the central government, that the ULBs are really not involved. However, the reality of it is that a lot of the officers who are involved and the contractors and the consultants who are involved are the same people. So they're going from the national level through to the state level to the local level. And right now, because a lot of the states and actually some of the, like in some of the more wealthy towns and cities that I worked in, the ULB is pretty strong and they hire their own consultants. So there's a lot of pull and push. And I mean, I've been in situations where you're sitting across the table from the same consultant who did the national policy. So there's that consultant. Also, like the administrative officers, they have also come through the state process, and the ULB commissioner, the DC, is quite, the ULB commissioner is very powerful. So he or she, he can also make decisions. And the interesting part that I found is that they know how to, and I mean, for lack of a better word, play the system better. So they will delay. They will push projects, and so, I mean, on one of my projects, for example, I just couldn't understand why we weren't getting forward with it. And then we realized finally, because there were some issues with the politics of the whole thing, and the new government was going to come in, and there was something, they had basically strategized in such a way that it would be moved, and there'd be some decision taken. So you realize that the power play that happens, and this is done very sophisticatedly. And sometimes I wonder, who's vulnerable in this whole process, and that you have to because you go in with this mindset, oh, you're making it, there are people who are very poor on the ground. And then you have to start looking at, even at the local level, at the you have to realize that even like the village headman that who's going to come for that meeting, invariably in all these consultations, they're all men, they're upper caste men, they are, wealthy men. Much of India, a lot of the, I mean, there is a significant amount of wealth now in a lot of the rural India too. So, and of course, there are very poor areas also, and they have their own ways of engaging with the state, which is like contestation, essentially. Road dharnas and things like that. And I have to say, there's a distinction here because a lot of my projects that I work in with smaller towns, not large cities. So the dynamics that happen and the strategies that I use there are very different from what is happening. And these are, and a lot of places like the local MLA is a very powerful man. And invariably it's a man. What is interesting for me, what I've seen in the last 10 years here in India, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of women in positions of power in government. And so the dynamics of that interplay is also very interesting because it's interesting to see how the men who are negotiating, and very often these are your local MLA or your local headman or whatever, comes in. Of course, he's very, very what is the word? How should I use this? He's very, very respectful to the district commissioner or the local IAS officer, whatever. Behind the scenes, you don't know what is happening, right? And so these things are constantly being pushed back. A lot of pull and push, and so one has to be constantly aware of who's in the process and what is happening. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Could have sort of longer discussions on this, but I think I'll just check to see if there are any further questions from the audience.
Yeah, Arunima, the question. I'd like to respond.
Please.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for this question, because of course it's actually basically you mentioning that this project is funded by a French development agency, which not only is an institutional partner involved in politics or in geopolitics, or in diplomacy with India. I would say that is more accurate than questioning it through the kind of colonial perspective, because of course it is, but I mean, it's not the only actor which is investing in India who has this ex-colonial attitude or perspectives or attitudes. So, but the fact that a research project being funded by a public French agency, of course, could have could enter into the game. Actually, first mentioning that they are not interfering in anything else than giving us money and allowing us to work. But it's like the Ford Foundation will fund a research, but this is more complicated than that, because the justification, and actually we fought to have some funding from them just because they were involved in the kind of expertise with the smart city mission. And as they were in a kind of very locked situation interacting with the government, they couldn't kind of negotiate the grant or the grant they were trying to implement in Pondicherry. So they thought, okay, why not funding local small research, which is social science, so it's not very important, to just like do some flagship projects saying that France is still investing in India and in Pondicherry. So of course it affects at a kind of larger scale, or it's like a implicit or silent narratives, but we are trying to deconstruct that also, but not in this perspective. Actually, I was myself part of the French external affair ministry, and now I am not anymore, so I can talk now. I couldn't two months ago. So that's also involving a research we are trying to formalize on the governance in the context of diplomacy. So that's something else, but it doesn't affect on the local investigations. I hope it responds. Thanks.
Thank you. Rahul, I think there's one more question for you. I think that this is
No, so actually there isn't much evidence or justification at all for why the weights are changing. I actually had a few qualitative slides in which there is some, I found some information, but the official documents don't actually say anything. I mean, there is one report that I had seen by one of a senior official in MP. I'm just opening up the presentation. I didn't show you these slides, where they talk about how changes in the pattern of the survey have resulted from the fact that some cities have cracked the code for ranking high in the SWOT survey, right? So then it says the center has included additional components for ULBs. ULBs like Indore, Ujjain, which had excelled in the last such survey, should not be overconfident about their performance. So, I am not saying that it's any one of these reasons, right? I'm not saying that there's diverse interpretations. And so that's why I test three possible pathways. One of them is more like a gaming pathway. The other is really just trying to improve the weights. And the third is really learning about what smaller cities need. And rather than sort of deciding on what the motivations are, based on very thin data that's out there in terms of what the government has actually said about the weight changes, I am letting the data speak for itself. And so, like I said, I cannot from these data tell you what the actual motivations are, but I can infer in some sense what the outcomes of those possible motivations might be. And so that's the limitation, right? So in that sense, yes, a deeper qualitative project trying to sit with some of these people, understand, talking to them about, what was the rationale behind some of these changes is really where this should be going next. That's why I said just 1/3 of the project, a really sort of initial effort to try and see what does the data just tell us. In terms of exogenous, that's my analysis of how to use a change in the weighting effectively as an identification strategy, right? They are exogenous, right? It is something that is happening from the outside. The question is, to what extent do we treat that as a shock to the system? That's a qualitative effort on part of the researcher. And I believe that in this sense, it might have a fairly strong impact given the long implementation timelines that are actually required to bring about real change on the field. So thank you for the question. It's a really important question. Thanks a lot.
Sorry, Neha, I have one question for Rahul. Can I ask that?
Please,
Yeah.
of course.
Okay, so I was kind of interested in your ranking system because I was many years ago engaged in a project kind of similar in Gujarat. What was interesting, and this is where the human aspect comes in, and that's what I'm interested in knowing, is that so these were the ULBs were being asked to put in the data. Now the problem was there was, for lack of capacity, and I use that word very loosely, language was a problem. So they were basically anybody who was a consultant or an NGO was being roped in to fill in the data. So you can imagine what the quality of the data was. And that is something that I'm not sure if that's improved over time. Like that was about 15 years ago. And I want to ask you about the quality of that data based on the human input that's going to go into the system.
No, so for sure, I haven't looked at that. And of course, these data that I have cannot tell that story. I have had a lot of informal conversations about this across a few cities. None of them is documented well enough for it to be research worthy. But there are some cities in which these CM fellows are, kind of assigned that work. In other cities, it is, there are many cities which is not taken very seriously, right? Just forget SWOT survection. This is actually the case that I've heard from even other kinds of rankings that are going on right now. So yes, so one, I think just very broadly, I would say, without giving you a firm yes or no from a research perspective, this is a problem. Much of it is outsourced even now or given to people within the government who have no other real work to do, and the quality is very poor. And actually, that's what the administrative data problem is. It's small cities might actually be cleaner. I don't say small cities are less capacitated because they don't have the capacity to be cleaner, but they're less capacitated because they don't have the capacity to actually collect this data.
Yeah.
And so yes, totally, that's continues to be a problem.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for a very, very interesting panel and a set of really thought-provoking discussions. We're almost at time, and I'm also well aware that I stand between you and the rest of the weekend. And so if there are no further questions, I'd like to close both the panel and this year's Urban Arc. Thank you all very, very much for having engaged and attended the panels. We've really enjoyed listening to all of them over the last 2 to 3 days, and we'll all hope to see you again next January. So stay safe, be well, and thank you all for coming.